The anti-fracking campaign is being fuelled by baseless scaremongering, according to one of the experts debating the issue in Canterbury last night. An audience of around 200 turned out to hear both from opponents and supporters of the controversial technique, which could be used in Kent to drill for shale gas. The accusation comes from scientist Dr. Nick Riley, director of energy company Carboniferous Limited. He joins us now, as does Julie Wassmer from East Kent Against Fracking. First of all, if I bring in Dr. Nick Riley, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
You say scaremongering, but presumably your opponents do have some valid points.
Yes, they have valid concerns, and it's right to be concerned about the safety of any industrial operations. But there were various claims made last night which are completely erroneous and are scaremongering, and one was the claim about birth defects associated with oil and gas operations in North America, and in particular a paper published from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And this was a study that was published earlier this year. And the actual chief medical officer of that department, obviously there's academic freedom for researchers to publish, but this is a huge statement, so I don't want to go on too long about it. But these were his summary comments. Overall, we feel this study highlights interesting areas for further research and investigation, but it's not conclusive in itself. We agree there is public concern about the effects of oil and gas operations on health, including birth outcomes. While this research paper was an attempt to address those concerns, we disagree with many of the specific associations which the occurrence of birth defects noted within the study. Therefore, a reader of the study could be easily misled or become overly concerned. As Chief Medical Officer, I would tell pregnant women and mothers who live or who at the time of their pregnancy lived in proximity to a gas well not to rely on this study as an explanation of why one of their children might have had a birth defect.
Okay.
Many factors are known to contribute to birth defects, and they were ignored in this study.
Okay,
That's just one example.
I understand that you want to you want to make that point about the debate from last night, but you can understand why people in Kent would be worried about maybe their drinking water, because we understand that if fracking does happen, that it would happen underneath aquifers that provide our drinking water. So
yes, but that's strongly regulated by the Environment Agency, and the Environment Agency has already decreed and has already actually, you're talking about the chalk aquifer in South East England, has already denoted areas where it will not give permits for people to drill to protect that groundwater.
Okay, let me introduce our second guest, Julie Wassmer from East Kent Against Fracking. Good morning to you, Julie. You were at this debate as well last night.
Yes, I was.
Let me just ask you to reply to a couple of those points. First of all, let's talk about the contaminated water issue. It's never really happened to any significant extent, has it, to those places that have been fracked in America? This is something that maybe is scaremongering, would you agree?
No, not at all. I mean, what Nick has just said about last night, those particular statements were actually made not by an anti-fracking campaigner, but by somebody called Mike Hill, who actually advises the EU on the lack of regulation in this country, which he feels is very scanty. The problem with water, especially in Kent, and we are obviously speaking about Kent here with the chalk aquifer, is Graham Warren from the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, Kent, is a hydrogeologist who was with the Environment Agency for almost 30 years. That's one of the regulatory bodies for this industry. And it was his view that the applications that went in for exploratory drilling in August 2013 ran a risk of the irreversible contamination of the aquifer that supplies 70% of our county's water. If you're talking about America, of course, you know, it's a totally different scenario. Even the geology is different there. We can't really compare, especially because there was something called the Halliburton loophole, which basically exempted fracking companies in America from the Safe Drinking Water Act in 2005. And what that meant was if you were a farmer or a family that suffered water contamination, you had to go directly to the company to seek compensation, and often the signing of non-disclosure agreements were part of that arrangement. You know, that's widely known, widely reported, with even children as young as 7 and 10 signing these non-disclosure agreements, agreeing never to speak about fracking for an entire lifetime.
Okay, Julie, can I just go back to Nick for a moment? Is it pointless trying to compare fracking in England to fracking in America?
No, there's an awful lot to be learned from the American experience, and there have been over 100,000 wells drilled in America, and there is absolutely no evidence that a fracture has made contact with groundwater. There is evidence, and it's been recently published by... I'm trying to remember which organisation it is, but it's a very highly regarded academic organisation in the US using modern isotope techniques, and they did manage to home in on 8 clusters where there was groundwater contamination. They could show that there was no contact with the fracking whatsoever. It was failure of the conventional parts of the wells. Some of these wells were very old. They're not built to the regulatory standards of here, and in fact the regulatory standards have now been improved in America to avoid that. And it was methane. Methane is not toxic. I mean, saying that, groundwater would be irreversibly damaged and damaged forever, that's not true. Even if there are instances where groundwater gets contaminated, often it can be remediated and often it naturally clears itself up.
Okay, Julie, back to you for a moment, because I know that one of the other arguments from the anti-fracking side of the debate was a threat to house prices, that house prices would go down in areas where fracking happens.
Yes.
Is that clutching at straws a bit?
No, it's actually happened in Lancashire. There was a report this year. It was in the national newspapers. A woman whose home had been worth £750,000, and with the promise or the threat of more fracking in Lancashire, that was revalued at something like £195,000, with 2 estate agents actually saying they weren't sure if it was really worth anything.
Okay, Nick, we'll just go back to you quickly. Without getting into too much technical detail, if people are worried about their house prices, surely you can understand why they'd be against fracking.
Well, why are they worried about the house prices? It's because of the fear campaigns of the anti-frackers. There is no basis, in fact, for them to be frightened. And there was an article in the Sunday Times and a rebuttal, actually, about the valuation of house prices, which obviously I haven't got that to hand. But, if you're going to create fear, naturally that's going to affect prices. So this is a sort of self-fulfilling circle from the anti-frackers.
Julie,
yes, I must actually say, if anyone is actually scaremongering in the UK at the moment, it is our government and this industry, by saying that we are facing an energy crisis which can only be bridged by shale. It's absolutely not true. In an earlier report I heard this morning on Radio Kent, you mentioned actually the UKIRK report, which came out exactly a week ago, the UK Energy Research Centre report, which actually said that shale gas is hyped, that shale gas has been completely oversold. And what we know is that this is an academic consortium covering 30 institutions, and Professor Jim Watson, the research director, actually said it's extraordinary that ministers keep making these statements. They clearly want to create a narrative, but we are researchers, we deal in facts, not narratives, and at the moment there is no evidence of how shale gas will develop in the UK. The really important point here is that it is not known how much of this shale gas is producible or safely accessible.
Nick,
and there's also a limited future for gas as part of the UK electricity system, because it has to be phased out.
Let's just go back to Nick. Nick,
this is, again, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I wanted to mention that UK report. It's quite a good report, actually. And there is a point Julie does have, that things are overhyped. But the reason we don't know what we can produce is because the anti-frackers are slowing down the rate of exploration. We've hardly had any exploration. Until we do the exploration, we won't actually know the answers to these questions. So my statement is, get on with the exploration. Once we know or don't know whether we can produce this stuff, then we make the decisions about where we produce it, and we have the appropriate regulations.
I have to just reply to that and say,
Julie, let me just ask you, Julie, would you be happy with scientific research done before they actually start exploring? Would you be happy to then have a conversation afterwards about that?
Well, the problem is that fracking has already taken place in this country. In 2011, Quadrilla fracked in Lancashire, and that caused 2 seismic events which actually led to a suspension of fracking in the UK until very recently.
Okay.
And this is the problem. It has happened. We were told that the regulations were in place then. then. They clearly were not, because, even the Energy Minister, Charles Hendry, gave a stern rebuke for Cuadrilla at that time. We have experience of A2EHF in one place in Lancashire.
Okay. All right,
and
Julie,
we do not want it until there's a robust regulatory regime, and that is not likely to happen. That's the point.
All right, Julie, thank you very much indeed. Julie Wassmer there from the East Kent Against Fracking Group. Also, you heard Dr. Nick Riley, Director of Energy Company Carboniferous Limited. They were both at a debate last night about fracking in Kent. Still ahead on BBC Radio Kent Breakfast, we'll be back to John, who's at